Hi, this is Kelsey. I'm not going to really have any video clips for this one. I'm just going to talk about it. I was originally going to write an article here, but then it occurred to me that there's just a lot to cover and there are a lot of different ways that I could go with this. And maybe my ranting isn't the most brushed up or polished, but this is a topic about which I can go on nearly inexhaustibly about. It's OMG. And talking about their roster situation and where they are in terms of their AD carries and their supports, and specifically looking at the dynamic between UZI versus San, and then maybe a little bit later touching on when OMG might want to use Young, when they might want to use Cloud, and when they might want to use Law. And please, please never .S7. But let's start out with just talking about something that maybe people aren't as familiar with when they discuss the carry potential of OMG's AD carries. You know, this triple threat situation where they have going, cool UZI, and they can run protect UZI comps. They can make cool their primary carry. They can have going maybe come out sometimes on like the Hecarim or the Aurelia or whatever and just run away with the game. But I want to address this idea that UZI is only now making this a triple threat composition, a triple threat team, whereas San, I think, is a little bit overlooked in some of the different things that OMG used to be able to do with them. And to really do this justice, we have to go back to 2014 LPL Spring, which really it wasn't that far away, but a lot of new fans to LPL may not have watched it, and a lot of old fans maybe would have stopped watching it because frankly, it was the dark ages of LPL. It was probably the worst split of all four. Let's be real, okay? We make all these excuses about the IEM, and I'll be really honest. Like they're excuses. The patch changes, the fact that WE and IG were 4th and 6th at the time, which is definitely true, but when you look at what happens to a lot of these teams going into LPL Spring, it's really depressing. So you think about like your top 5 teams: Positive Energy, Invictus Gaming, WE, OMG, Royal Club. Royal Club, everyone knows, they kind of completely fell apart at the seams. Tabe retired, White's retired, Lucky retired, and I mean, Lucky isn't really, and even Tabe. But the issue here is that they moved UZI from AD carry to mid. They're originally going to go with this guy called Sin, and I don't know if he has this huge attitude problem, but he is in and out of teams like crazy. He's constantly changing his name. But the one thing everyone says is that he's extremely talented. So they were going to have him on AD carry and put UZI in the mid lane. Okay, so that's something. It didn't really work at all. That guy ended up not playing. They ended up with a guy called Lei, who's currently playing support for King, and let's just say that that's a much better decision. But anyway, so that's what happened to Royal Club. What happened to Invictus Gaming is they actually got a mechanical upgrade in their support position. They went from Xiao Xiao, who at the time was really mostly known for missing his Sona ultimates, to Kitties, who right now, if you watch LPL, he looks really solid. Even now, and he's grown into a much better shot caller. I believe the team has said he and Kakao are the primary shot callers right now, but at the time, PDD was the shot caller, okay? And the difference between some of the decisions that IG made with Xiao Xiao as a shot caller and PDD as a shot caller, I mean, talking about IG, they never really had the best decision making, but it was really palpable. And they went from like a contention for first place team in spring 2013 to like a 6th place team going into IEM right last spring. So that was unfortunate. WE split apart at the seams. We had the formation of EDG, but at the same time we lost Messiah, who was the primary shot caller at the core of WE. It took them a while to get back into that roster. A lot of retirements in that sense. OMG, we talk about OMG, they lost their mid laner, Cool, and everyone thought, this team is gone, right? Cool is the core of OMG, and we'll get into more of that later because this is the primary focus. And finally, Positive Energy, they lost their bottom lane, which was really the core of the team after Jing left. Like, they managed to carry that team to a win in LPL playoffs against OMG, even without Jing, right? So you have these teams that just kind of are splintered apart, and there's not really a whole lot to fill the void. I think everyone was looking at Invictus Gaming and Edward Gaming at the time. Edward Gaming was looking pretty promising. People were saying good things about them in scrims, but that's still like 2 teams compared to 5 that were pretty competitive last year. I mean, we talk about WE falling off, but they were still in contention, and people thought they might even go to Worlds, right? At the end of last year, at the end of 2013. But there wasn't a whole lot left. And people were especially down on OMG, which I touched on briefly, because after the 2014-13 summer, excuse me, I keep mixing up my ears, MVP status, Cool was looking really hot. He was undefeated on Ari. We talk about his surprising synergy with Loveling after Loveling moved from support to jungle. And you always had that in 2013 spring, even when he was on support. So the question was on even Loveling's effectiveness without some of that synergy. The meta was going strongly in favor of tanks, right? So Gogoin could no longer, it would be really hard for him to play this carry style role. And then they brought Pomelo back to jungle and moved Loveling to support. So you're losing like your 3 primary damage threats, as people consider them on OMG. And they replaced Cool with this solo queue player who is known for playing Syndra, LeBlanc, and Cassiopeia. And it's really hard to think about, as an OMG fan, what you might be thinking going into this split. Like, what are they doing? This is not going to be good. This is going to be a bottom team. But then this is the punchline, where they go 12 games in a row without dropping. 12 games. They ended up being extremely dominant, even over Edward Gaming. And they had, when Xiong could get Syndra, he would go into the jungle and he would just kill the jungler after like solo killing the mid laner in 2 minutes. And so this is kind of the thing that people think about when they think about OMG in this time period. But to be completely honest, like Xiong didn't even play Syndra terribly much. I mean, I'm in the first half. In the second half, they could get it a lot. People were kind of afraid of OMG at this time. They could do a lot of different things. No one could really beat them. They only dropped 3 games the entire 2014 spring. And you think, okay, so Gogoing and Xiong must have carried, but it really wasn't like that. I would like to point to, when we talk about the dark ages of LPL, like how truly dark they were, this game between OMG and Royal Club. And you think, maybe OMG and Royal Club, that's exciting, right? No, it's awful. 63 minutes, I think there was a Dr. Mundo, this was patch 3.15 or 3.16, I can't remember exactly, when Dr. Mundo was really overpowered and unkillable, like the health buffs and the, it was bad. And so Royal Club simply couldn't be defeated because of this Dr. Mundo, this tank line. And when you look at what happened in that game, it took like 40 minutes for Sans Sivir to just get to this point where he could completely destroy people, like this massive damage output. And so OMG started funneling people into these little tiny crevices. And the way they would do that is he would pop the On the Hunt, and he would go into these spaces between, in the jungle camps, and people would follow him kind of single file, and there would be the tank line from Gogoing Renekton and everyone else, just kind of to lock them down. I think Xiong was playing Ziggs in this game, and San would just mow them with the Boomerang Blade and the auto attacks and the Ricochet and everything else. So that's a lot of how OMG's games went during this era. They had a really long average game time. We think of Edward Gaming, and we know they had a really long average game time in 2014. In 2014 spring, OMG actually had the second longest average game time. They had significantly shorter average second game times, but their first games were always really rough while they figured out what they wanted to do against this opponent. And I think especially during the first half, San was the primary carry of that team. He was the late game carry. They would focus on him. He wasn't ever super good in lane. He was a lot better with Loveling. Again, Loveling is the best support that team has ever had. And they would send him off into a side lane and farm, and he would just farm for a really long time until he got to this point where he could, like, 3-shot people. He was able to keep himself out of fights effectively enough, and I think this is the primary difference we draw here, is how safe San used to play. He wasn't like a mechanical god, but he could carry when he gets to this point. And then when you transition to 2014 summer LPL, you look at the same roster. and by the same roster, I mean they had Loveling, Go Going, and Sandstill, and they had Loveling in the jungle. They had two different supports, the Dada 7 and the Cloud, and Cool was back mid. But when you look at this, they actually were able to keep this triple threat kind of situation. And this is when I think of OMG as a triple threat team. I think of this 2014 summer split, when they could run these Kog'Maw compositions, like the really silly Braun Thresh frontline, where they could create the box and the stand behind me, and then Sand would be ridiculously safe. And he could have these games where he went with the crazy scorelines, like the 17-0 or whatever else, and he would carry those games. And I mean, it's not like he's going to be the guy who demands all of the resources. He's not going to be able to do this like every game. It's not a viable strategy to make this around him, but he's like this third threat that people don't... I used to call him the knife in the back. And I think this is a phrase that was used also by the casters at All-Stars after they talked to me a little bit about the San as the knife in the back for OMG. So I think this is a really interesting point to bring up when you talk about OMG as a triple threat composition with UZI now, as opposed to their potential to be a triple threat composition in 2014 summer. And then, of course, when you get into like the second half of 2014 spring, they played much more to what Xiang liked to do. They forced those 4v0s like every single game, so that there just wasn't any jungle pressure on mid lane. He could do whatever he wanted, things like that. But for the first half of spring, we will say that San was the primary carrier. And then looking into, again, going forward, the roster swap with UZI, how that team works out and how that team looks now. And when we see the games, they're really not together. The smartest things they do are always with Sivir. I think Sivir plays more of that style that San used to play. When UZI plays Sivir, he plays more of that style that San used to play, going in the side lanes, farming, getting like the really early towers. So this is different. I think that UZI has created this opportunity for OMG to get this like early snowball when they play around him more, because taking the early towers is how you get your gold at this time. And so he's really good at being able to sort of chop down these early towers, be in the side lane, kind of do his own thing there, and be aggressive in that sense. And I'm talking about being aggressive on creeps, but being able to pressure these lanes really effectively. Now, when you talk about when he plays Vayne, or when he even plays Kalista, or sometimes even Caitlyn, some of these other champions, he's trying to play that same Royal Club style that he used to play. And by that I mean he would demand all of this peel, and people keep talking about the gold and the spreading of resources, and I don't care about the gold, honestly. Like, I feel like each of these players can also play pretty effectively from behind. They can also carry from behind, these sorts of things, and I'm talking about the resources and the compositions that they were forced into, like the Orianna compositions, some of the like Lulu compositions. If you look at the Dark Ages again, the 2014 spring, when the mid laner would only play Lulu, and UZI switched back to support. Honestly, the reason why there's this tension here is because we talk about OMG, we talk about cool with OMG fundamentally, and they're not a team fighting team. They can team fight really well, but they have to team fight around these creating skirmishes, and you can use like a Jarvan pick very effectively for this. You can use the Lissandra pick very effectively for this, where you create kind of these almost two separate fights, where there's an opportunity for an assassination pick with Cool, and then you have the other teams like the other people zoning out the rest of the team, and then they can kind of all collapse after the assassination goes down. So that's kind of how I think of OMG's team fighting. In terms of the way UZI wants to play, he wants to go in, get all the peel, and then just kind of outplay 5 members of the enemy team. This is the huge disconnect between them, and I think that when we talk about who should be the primary carries of OMG, if you say Cool and UZI, that's something you cannot say, because until they figure something out, this is always going to be the tension in terms of how these two carries want to play the game. And That's the big problem that I see at the core of why UZI is not working. In terms of how they're working around San, again, he can carry if they need him to. He's just much more, what does the team need? He is the guy who goes and comes in and he plays back, he plays safe. But he can carry if they need him to. He can just push out waves on Graves if they need him to. He can farm off to the side. He can do some damage in teamfight, but he'll stand like 10 yards back while Cool does his thing so that people don't have to worry about him getting collapsed on. And of course he makes positional mistakes in the mid game. Like sometimes he's just walking around and is like, why are you there, San? Like what are you doing? But this is San kind of takes a step back. If you have UZI and Cool both taking steps forward, there's a tension. And I think that's the real crux of the issue. Now, let's go back to the Dark Ages again and talk about UZI's potential for adaptability. I am probably one of the only people I know who actually really liked UZI as a mid laner. I think that his mid lane was actually really interesting to watch. Because you think of UZI as this selfish, demanding of resources, and he tried to play that initially. He actually could really easily just 1v1 the mid laner, and then he'd end the game with like 8 kills, everything else. But they'd lose, right? So he transitioned into this more roam heavy style, and he picked up Syndra. And he used to roam with KMI, who's like the jungler who is the only other competent player really on that Royal Club roster. And they would go to separate lanes and they would just force the side lanes to win, just by sheer will showing up, ganking repeatedly. And then that's how Royal Club started winning some games with UZI as the mid laner. This wasn't really, again, an effective strategy for the long term, but it was just the way that they duct taped it together to not be in last place. And get auto-relegated. So I looked at this adaptability of UZI, and I thought to myself that he has that there. Like, he could actually be this kind of team player, but right now it's just not working. So I think, again, the long-term goal is to be able to have these team compositions that can transition from, okay, Going's carrying this game, okay, Cool's carrying this game, and okay, UZI, but I don't think you can ever have, as they are now, unless UZI or Cool drastically change their preferred style of play, you can't have a situation where they're both the primary carries at one time. You have to either go with Going in UZI, or you have to go with Cool and Going right now. You can't, I don't think that just that terms of play style preference will work. But I do think, again, that there can be some adaptability. And we've seen Cool play things other than Assassins. He's like really good on that Twisted Fate, but again, it's still the pick comp style kind of play. He actually can play a really good Lulu. His Orianna's pretty decent, but again, in terms of preferred core styles of play. So I think I've talked a lot about the AD carries. I think I want to talk a little bit more about the supports and why there would be this rotation of 3 support players, especially when people look at Cloud and his Worlds performance and they think, this guy, he's just really good, right? He's the best support that they have on their roster. Well, of course, Loveling is still the best support that they have on their roster. And he can play Janna really well, he can play Thresh really well, that's great. He is really bad at these all-in engage type supports. And I haven't, to be fair to him, I haven't seen him play the Annie, but I've seen him play like the Alistar. I've seen him play a couple other things. And initially, when he first came into LPL, Hubo, I think, Soldier was, shout out to him, was like the only person that I was talking to at the time who thought he was actually going to be really good. He seemed to choke a lot. But as time ramped up, his Thresh was just probably the best Thresh in China, right? And he constantly would do the roam mid lane, he would get the hooks, things like that. I think UZI and Cloud is a terrible bottom lane pair. It's probably the highest mechanical duo that they have, but in terms of their playstyle, again, UZI has been playing with the Zero type support. Zero, if you look at Zero on Starhunt Royal Club now, doesn't look that great because his playstyle is very reliant on him having a stellar, amazing AD carry. He does the peel thing really well, he sets up really well, he resets fights really well. He of course has the really good thrush play with the really good engages, but again, in those 2v2 situations, you need like the strong AD carry to follow up. Whereas I don't think his vision control is necessarily that great. I don't think he's necessarily playing for the team. He isn't really like focusing on multiple people when he peels. He's focusing on resetting this one maybe ill-advised engagement by one player. So UCI is used to playing with that kind of support, whereas Cloud, I think, is almost the complete opposite of Zero in every regard. He's much more, I think, also much more mid lane oriented in terms of he will go mid, he'll roam mid, he'll get the picks there just from the side. He wants to do more, plays more vision, he wants to do more roaming, he wants to, if a team fight occurs, he wants to make the Janna ults kind of to create a pick composition type situation. He wants to make the Janna ults to reset engages on the entire team. He's not primarily concerned with UCI. UCI will tumble forward and he'll probably kind of look at that and be like, what are you doing? You're gonna die. I can't help you. So I think that's actually a terrible combination. When we talk about Xiang, I don't really know much about him as a support, but I imagine that his champion pool is actually probably pretty shallow, just because his champion pool in mid lane was pretty shallow. At the end, I think he had like a pretty good Syndra, a pretty good Syndra, a pretty good LeBlanc. I haven't seen his Cassiopeia, but supposedly it's great in solo queue. And he had a really, really great Zed. I think his Zed was pretty good. At the very end. In some of these off-season tournaments that they played while Cool was still making up his mind, and no one really bought that anyway, but whatever, we'll go with it. So that's kind of Xiang, and you can make jokes about, okay, you look at Syndra, you look at LeBlanc, he only plays purple champions, he played Morgana, but I think the Morgana pick is actually pretty good, because I would have actually liked to see the Xiang UZI lane. I think that would have been interesting. And again, I think that like Cloud and Sand probably don't get along in terms of chemistry, but the way their play styles work, it kind of does, because Sand doesn't really want to do the daring stuff anyway, and Cloud doesn't really care about him, so it works out pretty well. Overall, so I could see them playing Cloud when they want like this engage. They want the finesse, the mechanical supports, the really strong Janna to create the pick situations. Like again, Cloud has always worked really well with Cool. Like when I think about who Cloud on that team works the best with, it's Cool. And then when they want the heavy engage, like the all-in type situations, play Law. He's got like a decent Maokai. He's got a pretty good Annie. My only issue with his Annie is maybe he's not mechanical enough to get like to the correct vantage point to use the flash tibbers. He'll ult Mata repeatedly, things like that. Which I'm angry with Mata too. He ruins all my hopes and dreams, but he's a great player. And he's probably shouldn't be the focus, and if he is the focus of your ult, then you're playing in exactly to what you want him to do, what he wants to do. But he does have a pretty decent Annie anyway, so I think that that's where they want to go when they want like the all-in heavy style support. It would be great if he could play Alistar, because Cloud's Alistar is frankly really awful. And then you've got Law to kind of, or not Law, Xiang to play maybe some of these more intermediary, like be more in the middle. He can land some skill shots. We saw him land the Dark Binding. He can help in maybe a style that allows them to push out waves. I would like to see more of Xiang on support. Anyway, the main points that we kind of covered here is that Yuzi has some dimension to him, but he's right now, his conflict with Cool's playstyle and his playstyle makes it really hard for them to look at these two players as their primary threats in a single game. Or they have to really reevaluate, okay, so the early game we're just going to run around and we're going to get picks. Late game we're going to focus on, do we use Ari Charm as a peel tool? I don't know. Maybe. Who knows? That's something that they can consider. Um, yeah, and then the supports, they actually have a wide variety, and I actually think it makes sense to rotate out the supports. San, I think, has a lot more carry potential and is often overlooked by a lot of people. He's not going to be the mechanical god that UZI is, but he can be smart enough and patient enough to hard carry a game if it gets to the wire. So, anyway, thanks. The games this weekend should be great. I think OMG plays 3 sets, so that's why I wanted to get this video out. I'm going to go watch ULCS in an hour, so... carry to mid. They're originally going to go with this guy called Sin, and I don't know if he has this huge attitude problem, but he is in and out of teams like crazy. He's constantly changing his name, but the one thing everyone says is that he's extremely talented, so they were going to have him on AD carry and put UCI in the mid lane. Okay, so that's something. It didn't really work at all. That guy ended up not playing. They ended up with a guy called Lei, who's currently playing support for King, and let's just say that that's a much better decision. But anyway, so that's what happened to Royal Club. What happened to Invictus Gaming is they actually got a mechanical upgrade in their support position. They went from Xiao Xiao, who at the time was really mostly known for missing his Sona ultimates, to Kitties, who right now, if you watch LPL, he looks really solid. Even now, and he's grown into a much better shot caller. I believe the team dark ages of LPL. It was probably the worst split of all 4. Let's be real, okay? We make all these excuses about the IEM, and I'll be really honest. Like they're excuses. The patch changes, the fact that WE and IG were 4th and 6th at the time, which is definitely true, but when you look at what happens to a lot of these teams going into LPL Spring, it's really depressing. So you think about like your top 5 teams: Positive Energy, Invictus Gaming, WE, OMG, Royal Club. Royal Club, everyone knows, they kind of completely fell apart at the seams. Tabe retired, White's retired, Lucky retired, and I mean, Lucky isn't really, and even Tabe. But the issue here is that they moved UZI from 80. Maybe people aren't as familiar with when they discuss the carry potential of OMG's 80 carries. You know, this triple threat situation where they have going, cool UZI, and they can run protect UZI comps. They can make cool their primary carry. They can have going maybe come out sometimes on like the Hecarim or the Aurelia or whatever and just run away with the game. But I want to address this idea that UZI is only now making this a triple threat composition, a triple threat team, whereas San, I think, is a little bit overlooked in some of the different things that OMG used to be able to do with them. And to really do this justice, we have to go back to 2014 LPL Spring, which really it wasn't that far away, but a lot of new fans to LPL may not have watched it, and a lot of old fans maybe would have stopped watching it because frankly, it was I said he and Kakao are the primary shot callers right now, but at the time, PDD was the shot caller, okay? And the difference between some of the decisions that IG made with Xiao Xiao as a shot caller and PDD as a shot caller, I mean, talking about IG, they never really had the best decision making, but it was really palpable. They went from like a contention for first place team in spring 2013 to like a 6th place team going into IEM right last spring. So that was unfortunate. WE split apart at the seams. We had the formation of EDG, but at the same time we lost Messiah, who's the primary shot caller at the core of WE. It took them a while to get back into that roster. A lot of retirements in that sense. OMG, we talk about OMG, they lost their mid laner, Cool, and everyone thought, this team is gone, right? Cool is the core of OMG. Hi, this is Kelsey. I'm not going to really have any video clips for this one. I'm just going to talk about it. I was originally going to write an article here, but then it occurred to me that there's just a lot to cover and there are a lot of different ways that I could go with this, and maybe my ranting isn't the most brushed up or polished, but this is a topic about which I can go on nearly inexhaustibly about. It's OMG. And talking about their roster situation and where they are in terms of their AD carries and their supports. and specifically looking at the dynamic between UZI versus San, and then maybe a little bit later touching on when OMG might want to use Young, when they might want to use Cloud, and when they might want to use Law. And please, please never .S7. But let's start out with just talking about something that